Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our event this evening, Past Mastery, with Anne Seber, Jean Strauss, and Helen Rappaport. My name's Emma. I'm the Activities and Volunteer Manager at Willesden Jewish Cemetery, and I'm really excited to have you here tonight. It's going to be a really fascinating discussion, so really looking forward to hearing what all of these great writers have to say. Just a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any kind of technical issues, please do write those in the chat. I will answer them. I'll turn my camera off during the talk, but I'll be here ready to answer any questions that you might have. If you have any questions for the speakers, please put them in the Q&A, which is also at the bottom of your screen, and they will answer them at the end of the discussion. Really looking forward to hearing your questions. I'm now going to pass over to Anne, who'll be chairing for tonight.
Good evening, everybody. So my name is Anne Seber, and I'm a biographer, so I have a particular interest in what these two women are going to tell us. I couldn't be more thrilled to be introducing them. They're two of the best known biographers in the English-speaking world, each with a wide range of subjects, neither limiting themselves to a particular type. And it's very exciting that they're kicking off the first night, the first event at the start of Willesden Cemetery Lifeline, really bringing to life the people in this cemetery. And there's such a range of stories here. So Helen Rappaport is a Victorian specialist with a particular interest in the Russian royal family, Russian Revolution and Queen Victoria, books such as Magnificent Obsession and Four Sisters, but also she's written about Stalin and Lenin and women in the Crimean War, No Place for Ladies, and photography. But that's a very wide range, and tonight it's the Victorian cosmetics industry that we're going to be discussing, and particularly Madame Rachel, beautiful forever. And I gather that Madame Rachel's grave at Willesden is one of the most sought after for people who come for tours. Jean Strauss, sitting in her beautiful apartment in New York, is joining us tonight. It must be the middle of the day there. Jean is a biographer, a critic, and the author of a biography of Alice James, the invalid sister living in her brother's shadow, or so we all thought until Jean's masterful biography, a prize-winning book, which I remember reading with such excitement because it really showed how women behind a great man, or not necessarily behind, but sisters and mothers and daughters, really deserved their place in the limelight. And not surprisingly, it won the Bancroft Prize for History. She's also written about one of the most powerful men ever, J.P. Morgan. And now tonight she's going to be talking about a work in progress, the painter John Singer Sargent and his many portraits of the fascinating Wertheimer family. So lots to discuss. One of the main points of interest between these two subjects, I felt, was that there are so many books about Jewish subjects which are about victims, survivors, Holocaust, rags to riches, perhaps business, and most of them are men. And these books, Jean, I'm going to call yours a book because I know you're busy writing it and it's about to be a book. They're very different. Helen's book, Beautiful Forever, is a female rags to riches story. Well, rags to riches and down again to rags, of course. A criminal, a petty criminal, lowlife, seamy, horrendous court cases which Helen has recreated in vivid detail. Madame Rachel, well, she's a chancer. She simply is not your average Jewish subject. It's very refreshing. So Helen, this is one of your first books, if not the first. How on earth did you stumble about this extraordinary woman? What appealed to you about her? And over to you, tell us how you researched her life and why you cared.
Well, she wasn't my first book. She was about my fourth, I think. I was going through one of those fallow periods that authors often do, where they've finished one book and are thinking, oh my God, what am I going to do next? And you start searching around for subjects. And I've always loved the Victorian era. And as with Jean, I'm interested in women's stories in particular. And so I went, at the time I was living in Oxford, and I took myself down to the law library of the university, and I was reading up a lot of old Victorian trials and causes célèbres. And I found a couple of books that mentioned this Madame Rachel of Bond Street. And both of them had sort of, I don't know, a short chapter about her. This extraordinary Jewish con artist, cosmetician, to the rich and powerful ladies of London. And her story really had never been told. It had been lost because no one had actually written it as a single volume, as a book. And I was so intrigued by her story because she's such an anti-hero, and yet you kind of like her because she was clever and very wily and very inventive and a brilliant self-marketer. So I decided I'd have a look and see how much I could dig out about her. And this is where I was so fortunate that by the time I did this book, which was 2010, the press of the day were being digitized. And I think that has transformed the way so many historians now work, because I was able to recreate Madame Rachel's entire criminal career over 20 years from just searching through the newspapers and journals of the day, and also finding 2 or 3 extraordinary sixpenny pamphlets that were produced at the time of her trial. And the wonderful thing about Victorian legal cases in the press then is they reported them in minute details. So you get pages and pages on Madame Rachel's 2 very celebrated trials in the Central Criminal Court.
So before she was a criminal, who was she? What was her name and how did she start?
Well, her name is intriguing because she was very clever about hiding her background. She called herself Madame Rachel. She stole the name from Mademoiselle Rachel, the famous French tragedian, who'd been a Jewish tragedian who'd been popular in London in the 1840s. And so she came from very low beginnings. She was probably born in Longacre, Covent Garden area. Her father was probably a pawnbroker or a clothes dealer, something like that. She grew up in the Covent Garden area and started life selling hot potatoes, which were, you know, jacket potatoes were the fast food of the day in Victorian Britain. And also she, for a while, had a fried fish shop in Clare Market, because of course the Jews introduced fried fish, which they sold to fellow Jews on Fridays that they could then, you know, have cold the next day. So she was a fried fish seller and a hot potato seller. And then she moved gradually into making hair tonics. When her hair had fallen out, someone had given her a tonic and she thought, oh, this might be a way of making some money by developing a more sort of attractive, fashionable packaging. So she started off selling hair tonics in, again, Longacre, Covent Garden area, and then thought, oh no, the big money to be made now with women's growing interest in fashion and beauty in the 1860s was to move into the embryonic cosmetics industry. So she found herself some swanky premises on Bond Street and set herself up there with this glorious marketing catchphrase, beautiful forever. It was emblazoned above the shop. She promised she would make women beautiful forever. And from there, she took off.
Promising it ever since.
Yes, the wonderful thing about doing Rachel's stories, all the parallels with the cosmetics industry now, and women desperate to preserve their looks at any price and pay silly money. Because what's so extraordinary about Rachel is her products were bogus, pretty much. Also a little bit dangerous too. But fundamentally, she charged the most colossal amounts of money in comparison with today's money. If you look at, 10 shillings for a bar of soap in the 1860s.
So she was actually Rachel Leveson at this point, but she didn't make great play of the surname Leveson. Was that deliberate, or she just wanted to trade on Madam Rachel? And that's part of the question. And the other half is, how on earth did she attract these very aristocratic English women to come to her? Why did they trust Madam Rachel or Rachel Leveson?
Well, first of all, Leveson was the name of her common law partner. They weren't actually married because her first husband had disappeared and she'd never got a divorce. Her birth name was Sally Russell, but the Russells originally had come in. They were Ashkenazi Jews. They'd come in. They were Levi's, I think, or Levies. How she did it was, first of all, she brought out this very clever marketing catchphrase. She produced a pamphlet in which she described all these glorious, exotic face washes and creams and powders and bath essences from distant Circassia or Araby, her best-selling product, believe it or not, was magnetic dew water from the Sahara, brought by dromedaries across the Sahara, which actually in the end turned out to be pretty much tap water. But so she had this very clever knack of luring women in. And women then, if they heard Lady so-and-so had gone to Madam Rachel and she was looking fabulous at a ball, they thought, well, I want a bit of that too. So there was a certain competitive edge. But the reason she attracted and hooked her customers really was they did it in secret. They didn't want their husbands to know what they were getting up to going to cosmetician, because this is in the days before the Married Women's Property Act. So any money a woman spent was effectively her husband's money. And when they spent too much of their husband's money, that's when the blackmail started.
And therein, of course, lie the seeds of her downfall. We'll come back to her trials in a minute. I just want to turn to Jean because, of course, as I say, the link with Helen's work and your current work in progress is that John Singer Sargent made women look much more beautiful. But let's focus for a minute on the Wertheimers, Jewish art dealers at the top end of society. So again, far, far from victim Jews. It's in a way also not where you expect to see Jews in the 19th century, except I know the Rothschilds were already there and there were court Jews, so they weren't completely alone. But who were the Wertheimers and how did you discover them and why do you want to write about them in connection with Singer Sargent? So over to you.
Okay. Well, there were 12 paintings altogether that Sargent did of the Wertheimers, commissioned by Asher Wertheimer, who was an art dealer in London. Not Sargent's dealer. Sargent didn't really have a dealer, but they met, they became friends. And first Sargent painted Asher and his wife, and then went on and did all 10 of their children. It was the largest commission Sargent ever had, which probably makes Asher his greatest patron. The paintings, most of them belong to the Tate, and the Jewish Museum in New York organized an exhibition of them in 1999, which traveled around this country. And I saw it, happened to be in Seattle, I saw it, and I only went because I knew about Sargent. I'd never heard of Wertheimers. And I was really struck with curiosity. Who were these people? What was the relation? Clearly they were friends. Sargent had become friends with the Wertheimers. There were lots of photographs from the family showing him at their summer house in the country. There were labels about the different children and everybody. And I just wanted to know lots more. Who were these Jews I knew Sargent as a painter of British aristocrats and American grandees, but not of Jews. But I had just finished a book 2 years ago, 2 years before, and it had taken a lot out of me, the Morgan book, and I wasn't really looking for another project. So I bought the catalog, went back to New York, and it just never let me go. It's a long story, but people said there wasn't enough information about the Wertheimers to do this, and there isn't a lot, and I think it'd be interesting to talk, Helen, a bit about sources. I mean, yes, there are a lot of newspaper sources. It's not quite the same as having somebody's diaries and letters, and it's putting together stories without that, for the most part, is a little hard if you want to get inside people. But I eventually got in touch with several of the Wertheimer descendants, several of whom I believe are watching this program tonight. And they were immensely helpful and had much more material than I had been aware of or than anyone had seen. It's still not a thick archive the way the James family is or J.P. Morgan is, but there's a fair amount. And Sargent, of course, is, there's lots about Sargent, and the experts on Sargent, Richard Ormond, Elaine Kilmurray, Trevor Fairbrother, have been extremely helpful. So I basically kept going and eventually about 7 years ago decided I was going to go ahead and do this project. But what is this project? So I'm not writing about sort of a chapter per portrait, because not all the portraits are great and not all the people are interesting. So I'm trying to weave a story or braid a story about these characters and this time in British history, in actually transatlantic history, because Sargent was American. He was born in Florence, educated in Paris, never lived in America, but always thought of himself as American. And in many ways, he was never in England going to be one of us. And neither were these German Jews ever going to be one of us in London society. Quickly, Ascher's father came from southern Germany, although before that they were from Vienna and Frankfurt. He came to England in 1839 to the East End. He was an artisan, a bronze maker, and very quickly moved up, so that by 1854, within 15 years of his arriving in England, he'd opened a gallery in New Bond Street, a shop which was dealing in art and antiques. And he was making some of the objects and selling a lot. And he quickly developed a wonderful list of clients, the Rothschilds, among leading them the way. And both of his sons, Ascher and his brother Charles, went on to be very, very prominent and successful art dealers. So it's about that. It's about this time in transatlantic history when the British aristocracy is sort of in steep decline. Everyone's watched Downton Abbey. That's a little bit later, but it's, these families have wonderful estates and pure bloodlines and beautiful daughters and no income. And what they have to sell is art. Because it's
or their daughters. I mean, I'm so pleased you mentioned Downton Abbey, because I was going to say, it seems to me that Singer Sargent, from my perspective of an average gallery goer, is somebody who paints beautiful women, the dollar princesses as they're often known, because these paintings were used as their calling cards. And what you're describing is Singer Sargent as an outsider and the Wertheimers as an outsider family. So they have that in common. But I would never have seen Singer Sargent as philo-Semitic. I mean, I wouldn't have said he was anti-Semitic, but he seems to me somebody who's probably would be best described as waspish, white Anglo-Saxon aristocracy from America. So what was it about the Wertheimers? It wasn't simply that they were commissioning him and paying him lots of money, because he became genuine friends with them. How did they establish that friendship, and what was it about this Jewish family that made Singer Sargent so comfortable to be in their company?
Well, that's a very good question, but in fact, Sargent became known as the painter of Jews in London. I've counted, there are about 40, and I'm not sure I have all of them. He was very close to the Sassoons, Philip and Sybil, and their mother, Aline, who had been a Rothschild. Sir Charles Lewis, whom whom Helen mentions in her book, a lawyer for the Wertheimers and a friend. So he was, I wouldn't necessarily say philo-Semitic, but he was extremely comfortable with Jews and very close friends with many of them. So it wasn't as much of a leap for him to enter the Wertheimer world as we might assume, but I didn't know that at all before I started doing this. I mean, in a way, you could say they were both in trade. He was painting pictures for a living. Asher was selling pictures for a living. They all were very successful. Asher, his father, his brother, and Sargent. They lived very well. Asher lived at Connaught Place. His brother lived in, anyway, can't remember, but so it was, I think there was a way in which they could all completely relax with each other. And Sargent was, the dining room at Asher's house was called Sargent's Mess, partly because Sargent was there all the time for dinner. They had an excellent French cook, and Sargent really liked good food. But also 8 of the portraits were hung in that dining room. So it was quite a place.
And can we just touch on the anti-Semitism? And then I want to go back to Helen and talk about makeup. But just while we're on the subject, you said that they're now a bequest of the Tate, but there's a bit of a story that's more complicated than simply they ended up at the Tate. You're the expert, but from what I've read, Asher always wanted them to go to the Tate after his wife died. And there was some, that wasn't entirely popular. And the negative reaction was ascribed to anti-Semitism, all these Jewish portraits. Am I giving the right picture, or am I giving a garbled version of what happened?
Not quite right. He gave them, in 1916, he gave 9 portraits to the National Gallery, and very much wanted Sargent and his own family to be on display in the National Gallery alongside all these beautiful 18th century portraits that they both knew very well and other great portraits. He kept a life interest in them, and his wife kept a life interest. That was part of his will. But when she died in 1922, they went on exhibit in early 1923 at the National Gallery for the first time altogether. And there was quite a response. It was a hugely popular exhibition. People thronged to see it. And there were many, many positive critical responses. And the paintings had in fact been shown as they were painted each year. Sargent was showing at the Royal Academy every year, and he was, with 12 paintings, he was finishing them pretty regularly. But the climax of this drama is that there was a debate in Parliament about accepting these paintings. And one of the members asked whether there was anything else, there was any other gift of this size, of so many people from one family, implying Jews go in for excess. And actually what another member asked this man who asked the question, well, wouldn't you like shall we put your painting on display in the National Gallery? To which everyone laughed. But then the member of Parliament from Oxford, who was actually a historian at Oxford, asked the head of the committee here running the hearings, can't you arrange it so that we do not have to have these repulsive pictures on our walls for all time next to the beautiful examples of the work of Turner? Which was pretty harsh.
Close to the bone.
Well, you should, if I might interject, you should see the horrifically anti-Semitic cartoons of Madame Rachel.
I'm sure.
In the popular press at the time of her trial. They were as bad as some of the stuff you've seen in Hitler's Germany in the 1930s.
Yes. So
and the
Helen, I want you to say, what was Madame Rachel on trial for? Prosecuted, I think, by, as Jean said, Sir George Lewis, but
no, George didn't prosecute her. He was the barrister. He wasn't the barrister, he was the lawyer who was the nemesis.
Well, what was she accused of doing wrong? And can you take us through this process of enameling that she made her specialty?
Well, she was basically tried twice for fraud because of conning enormous amounts of money out of women for totally, really fraudulent cosmetics. The first time she preyed on a rather pathetic victim called Mrs. Mary Tucker Borrowdale, who'd just come back from India. She was a widow, and she was rather sort of, her skin had been damaged by the Indian sun. And she went to see Madame Rachel thinking that Rachel could transform her. And Rachel came up with this very clever ploy to persuade this twittery widow that in fact an acquaintance of Rachel's, Lord Ranelagh, who had met Mary Tucker Borrowdale at the salon where he used to come and visit Madame Rachel, persuaded her to believe that Lord Ranelagh had fallen in love with her and wanted to marry her, and she had to have all these expensive beauty treatments and buy carriages and beautiful clothes and this, that and the other in order to become his bride. It sounds completely balmy, but actually she conned, over a period of time, conned this woman out of practically all her money, her pension, her stocks and shares, practically everything she had. She sucked her dry in order for this woman to pay for all these absurdly useless cosmetic treatments. So Rachel was hauled up for fraud, and everyone, well, at the time there was, of course, none of this rule which we have now where you don't discuss a case before it's gone to court and there's been a verdict. The press were condemning her before the trial had even begun at the Old Bailey, pretty much for being a woman and for being a Jew. I mean, it's very, very clear to me the rampant anti-Semitism that was at work there. And it meant that she had quite a stiff sentence of 5 years, was sent to jail, initially Millbank, which was pretty awful, and then she was moved. And was let out on good behaviour after about 4 years, went to ground and went quiet for a while. And then again in the late 1870s, being the incorrigible fraudster she was, she started again. She got different premises up near where the BBC is, up that road there, and started practicing again on a slightly smaller scale. And the second trial is quite interesting because her second victim was rather more intelligent than Mary Borrowdale, and her skin was affected. And one of the
not affected by what? Will you talk about this process, enamelling?
Oh right, I mean, sorry, yeah.
It's such an extraordinary part of your book that women would think that if they had this, what was it, prussic acid poured on their face.
No, it wasn't quite as bad as that. In fact, I think Singer Sargent, did he paint Madame X?
Well, I'm going to come to that in a minute.
Because she was an example of enamelling that very whitened skin. What society ladies wanted was this beautiful, smooth porcelain skin to go to balls and receptions for the season. And how Rachel did it was she would cleanse the skin with some kind of astringent, remove fluff, I mean bits of hair fluff, you know, the surface of the skin, and then plaster on this very thick, glutinous cream kind of, it was like a very thick white mask of sort of fats and ground almonds and all kinds of things mixed together that would really stick to the skin and give it this kind of porcelain white look. But I always thought, how on earth could this be convincing? Because when these ladies had this white stuff plastered, and they would have their chests enamelled as well, down to their décolleté line, once they got all this stuff slapped on them, it was supposed to last for several days, right? Well, surely they must have had to go around with an absolutely rictus expression, because, you know, if they'd laughed or cried or done anything, this stuff would have started cracking. And they must have looked absolutely awful as it wore off. But women paid huge amounts to be enamelled for the season. And this went on right till the end of the century, because Princess Alexandra, later Queen Alexandra, she was a fan of enamelling. And as I said, there's that painting of Madame X with just incredible white face and shoulders and a very low-cut gown. And I think also the Dowager Empress of Russia went in for it as well. So it remained popular. But at the second trial, what came out was that among all her cosmetic treatments that she was flogging were these face washes. It's like an astringent face wash that we'd use now. And it was one of the first examples of a case where they called in, I suppose, an early version of a forensics guy who analysed this face wash she was flogging, which had dilutions of hydrochloric acid. And it had brought this woman's skin out in a terrible rash or pimples or something. So she got sent out for a second time for fraud.
Well, not surprising. So, Jean, where does this fit in with Madame X? You know, for those who don't know, that wonderful portrait. And I think it was the reason why Singer Sargent came to London, because it was considered so shocking. The beautiful woman in profile with a black dress, jeweled straps, and a very white face and white chest. How did she, what was the reason that she made herself so white? Was it chalk or enameling?
Well, I've always thought it was powder. I mean, that's the way they talked about it. That's what Sargent talked about. So I don't know about enameling, but everyone who's written about her, and now including me, said, I mean, it wasn't just white. It was a kind of lavender, almost green. And Sargent talks about it a couple of times in letters to people. And he was fascinated by her appearance. It was not a commissioned portrait. He wanted to do it because she was so performative, as we would now say. I mean, she was just, her appearance was she was a professional beauty, which was a new thing in those days. And she was actually American. She was from Louisiana. She married a wealthy French banker. And she agreed to have Sargent paint her, which he did. He had found it very, very difficult. And she liked the painting. And then it went on display in 1884 at the Salon. And it was greeted with laughter, with mockery, with disdain, quelle horreur. And it was quite, I mean, Paris is not so easily shockable. So it wasn't just, I don't think that it was her deep, low-cut décolletage and her white face. It was, I mean, Manet's Olympia was entirely nude. That was 20 years earlier. But she was a prostitute and probably a working class, I mean, completely from a different class, whereas Madame X was in society or aspiring to be in society. And I think that everyone knew who she was, and this painting that was stark. And I mean, it's an astonishing painting. And so it showed her performance, her white, green, lavender skin, her very snooty profile. And Paris just hated it. And she and her mother appeared at Sargent's studio that night in tears and asked him to take it back. And ultimately she went into seclusion. He didn't take it out of the exhibition. Her one strap was slipping off of her shoulder, which increased the impression of her being sexually available. And she did have a reputation as not a great, she did have a sexually available reputation. Sargent did take it back after the exhibition closed. He kept it in his studio. He had himself photographed with it and sold it to the Metropolitan Museum in New York in 1916, saying that he thought it was the best thing he'd ever done. And many other people thought so.
It's extremely interesting in positioning Sargent, because of course it's what so many people recognize now. This is what they will pick out, and it was responsible to an extent for making his name, but it has a deeply sexual theme running through it. I mean, Come Hither doesn't begin to describe the expression of it. It's a very sexually overt painting. Had Sargent continued to paint that sort of portrait, arguably he would not be as famous and he would not have been able to carry on in society. So, I mean, it was a double-edged sword in a way. Is that, I mean, he couldn't have gone on to paint the Wertheimers had he continued like that.
Well, I suppose that's right. I mean, it's very sexually powerful, but it's very cold. It's not a warm, inviting sexuality. it's really like look but don't touch. It's a really, I mean, great portraits do allow for a wide range of opinion. He had done other, this was early in his career. He was just 1984. Yeah, he was 28. And so he had done quite bold original paintings before this of Dr. Pozzi. I don't know whether you know that painting.
Oh, the man in the red coat.
Coat.
Oh, I love that painting.
And his teacher, Carolus Durin from Paris, he was really pushing limits in the kinds of paintings he was doing. And Madame X was definitely a shock and a setback. And he eventually moved to England, did that Carnation Lily, Lily Rose, that beautiful painting that's at the Tate, under the influence of Monet very much, who was a good friend of his, and thought he might have to give up painting altogether because of the response to Madame X, but eventually found new audiences in England and in the United States. And clearly we know his career did just fine. But that, there's so much about that painting to say.
Well, there's so much we're going to read in your book when it appears. I can't wait. And because I'm sure this is a bookish crowd, we just mentioned Man in the Red Coat. There's a wonderful book by Julian Barnes. I would recommend to you all, called Man in the Red Coat or Red Jacket. Helen, was Madame Rachel ever painted?
Well, there is a rather wonderful carte de visite of her. And I actually... Well, there are 2 or 3 slight variations of it, but I actually went through the eBay experience. Oh no, that's it's in the book. And it was rather one of those thrilling things. I don't know if you've ever done an eBay auction. There she is. That's the carte de visite. And I sat there chewing my nails, and I just got it. But that was in wide circulation, and a couple of variants of that. And I discovered a fascinating thing about that picture only fairly recently, which is that in fact it was a photograph of her Madame Tussauds effigy. She was into swords for a while, and in fact I contacted them to try and find out if they still had her, but unfortunately they didn't. But she was absolutely all over the press. And even long after her trials, 20 years later, if people in an article talking generally about women's beauty talked about beautiful forever or enameling or Madame Rachel, everyone understood that. Everyone knew what was being referred to. So and I found articles in the 1900s referring to her.
It's really extraordinary that until your book, she wasn't better known, and there hasn't been more written about her. But I just wanted to ask you, before I have to hand over to this audience for questions, so I hope you're all preparing what you want to ask, how you do your research and how helpful cemeteries are. I mean, you might think, oh, well, what's the point of going to a cemetery? The person's dead. But actually, I would say as a biographer, you often learn a lot from the gravestone. So, Helen, you've, I know, located that Madame Rachel was buried at Willesden. Has the journey to Willesden helped you? Is it an important part of your research?
Well, what it gave me was something that I put into the epilogue of the book, which was the irony of Madame Rachel, so notorious, so famous for all the wrong reasons in her lifetime. There she is buried in a completely unmarked grave at Willesden in a corner, really right out of the way, because obviously her family did not want to draw attention to her. And not more than about 100 yards away, it's this enormous chest tomb of Sir George Lewis, the wonderful Jewish solicitor who organised the prosecutions of her and really was her nemesis. So in that sense, it was great going to Willesden and seeing that juxtaposition, because I kind of end the book with it. But I like going to cemeteries. I love Kensal Green. I mean, for example, I went there in search of Mary Seacole and discovered another grave not far away that's actually quite an important tangent to her story. And in my own family history, I remember searching Abney Park for hours once for a family grave when I was doing genealogy, you know, family genealogy. I think you can learn a huge amount by just getting a sense of atmosphere.
Interestingly, Madame Rachel died in Woking prison, but there's no interjection on a criminal or somebody from prison being buried in a Jewish cemetery. And I mean, that could explain why it's an unmarked grave, because
Yeah.
when she died, she was hardly the person she had been. But is that your explanation of it?
I don't know what the rules are. Are Jewish cemeteries more discerning about not allowing criminals? I don't know.
I don't think so. I don't think so, or she wouldn't be there. Jean, how important to you is the fact that so many of these Wertheimers are buried at Willesden? I don't know how many. Perhaps you'll tell us, and how that's informed your research.
Well, I did visit Willesden maybe 7 or 8 years ago, one very chilly day with a friend, and 4 of my Wertheimers are there. Asher, his wife, and their 2 eldest sons who died in their 20s. So there are broken columns on those gravestones, and they're very impressive and very moving, and it's heartbreaking, the story about those sons. And then Asher's brother, who is a whole story on his own, Charles Wertheimer, he's there. His first wife is there. His second wife dedicated the tomb to him. All 4 of his children are there, and some of their children. So it's a huge other patch of Wertheimers. But the Duvines are there from the art world, several Rothschilds. I mean, it is an amazing look at social history.
Resource.
Yes.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And I just wanted to ask you, on the subject of lots of Wertheimers, the Wertheimer brothers I'm familiar with are the 2 in Paris, right, who invested in Chanel's perfume very early on, so another link with the cosmetics industry, and who Chanel treated so badly. Are they related to your Wertheimers?
I believe Pierre Wertheimer co-founded Chanel with
completely did, yes.
And then she tried to edge him out during the Nazi period, but he was very clever and got his money out of France and did just fine.
Yes, and he was one step ahead of her.
Yes, I can get them back to about 1790 in tracing the genealogies. I think they're all related way back, but there are so many Wertheimers, and I can't get a direct link between these. Also, the family that I am writing about, none of the sons had children. So all the names coming down through that family are not Wertheimer.
I see. Well, there probably is a link, but perhaps by the time we read your book, we'll discover it. There are so many questions I'd love to ask you, but I can see that people are dialing in their questions. Somebody has asked a specific question to you, Helen, about Woking prison, and I'm not sure that I'm going to find it now. I saw it pop up while we were talking, so I may have to hand over to Emma, our moderator, who will probably have to decide and make live whoever asked the question about Woking prison.
Is it about the women? It was a prison for invalid women, because Rachel was very sickly, and she was sent there from ordinary jail because it was too harsh with her condition. She had heart disease and dropsy, and I gather it later was converted into an army barracks. It's not a prison anymore.
I don't know. Emma, was that the question, or?
The question from Tessa Murdoch was, what dates was Madame Rachel in Woking prison?
Oh, right. She would have been there, the first time she was there was between about 1869 and 1872. And then the second trial was 1878, and she would have been there until she died in 1880.
Can I just interject something quickly? That you had mentioned that she was in Millbank prison before?
Briefly, yes.
Well, the Millbank prison is on the site that is now the Tate.
Tate, yes, yeah.
Cool. Tessa also asked, did Madame Rachel perhaps work in the Opus Criminalum mosaic flooring still in the V&A?
Yeah, there is a story that she was there at the same time as a famous murderess who was doing that work. Now, what was it? Florence Bravo? I'd have to check my book now. I can't remember, but yeah, they did mosaic work at the prison. There is definitely a link. I'm not sure if the two women actually met in prison there, but I think Rachel...
So the prisoners were brought to the V&A to make it in situ, or did they make the mosaic in the prison?
They were making it at Woking, because there's a thing about, I'm sure, you have to forgive me, I wrote my book 10 years ago, but I do mention that because there was a story about, I'm sure it's Florence Bravo who was prosecuted for murdering her husband, and she got off she avoided the death penalty, and she was noted for being very good at that work at Woking.
So you'll send us all off to the V&A to go and look at the mosaic floor, I expect, but and then we'll go to the Tate afterwards to look at the Wertheimer portraits. Emma, is there another question that you can?
Sure. There's one last one from Tessa Murdoch, which is, did Asher's daughters marry and remain in the Jewish faith?
Good question. Only 3 of Asher's children married Jews, 3 out of 10. And one of those men died almost immediately after his wedding. The other, a woman, her husband died. They never had children. So the one who both married a Jew and had children was Ina, the tall, beautiful one in the portrait of the 2 sisters. And she had many children, 5, I believe, and it's her descendants mostly that I'm in touch with. But I think that after that generation, they were not very Jewish. They were the 4, Flora, Asher, and the 2 eldest sons were buried in Willesden, but none of the others are from that family.
Jean, there's a question from Natasha asking if you have a favorite portrait among the
Wertheimers. I believe.
Well, I guess it's among the Wertheimers. Yes, you can spread it more widely.
I believe that's Natasha, who is one of the descendants who's been helping me.
So you better be careful.
Right. I have really 2 favorites. The 2 daughters, the Ina and Betty, that is one of the 2 great and famous paintings. And the other is Asher himself, which is a very controversial painting. It's sort of a Rorschach test, the Asher painting, because some people see it as really anti-Semitic. He looks very Jewish. Other people see it as intelligent, warm. There's a spark of laughter between him and Sargent. So they're really, as I said earlier, talking about Madame X, a great portrait affords a huge variety of responses, but I would say those are my 2 favorites.
I love the story, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, about when he painted Ina and she came with such energy that in order to recreate the energy, he told her to put a broomstick under her skirt, but actually, if you look closely, you can see the broomstick. Is that true?
Yes, that's a different painting. That is one he did later of just her. And she's wearing a man's military cloak. It was the Duke of Marlborough, actually, who was also sitting at the time and left his cloak there when he went back to Blenheim. And yes, you can see a little bit of the broomstick out of the side. It was because she arrived, the painting is called À vela gonfie, which means in full sail. She arrived late, breathless, with her scarves and coat flying out behind her, and he decided that's what he wanted. So that's what they did.
Fantastic. One learns so much. Here's a question. Have you got any further questions, Emma?
There's one more question from Bridget. Jean, what do you know about Flora Wertheimer's personality?
Bridget is also a Wertheimer descendant. Well, I've stacked the deck here. Not as much as I would like to know. She's rather invisible. Clearly, it was, I mean, they had 12 children, 10 children who lived, but they had several others who died. And it was a very strong marriage, I believe. She also came from a family of art dealers, quite successful. But I don't have any letters from her or about her. And there are some comments that the children made or the grandchildren made later, but I don't have a lot, I'm sorry to say. Whereas I know a lot about Asher and some of the offspring, but Flora is a mystery.
You're lucky to have even that, because for me, there's not a single piece of paper connected to Madame Rachel directly, like a letter, a diary, anything surviving. So I had to piece her story together entirely from secondary sources. I had no family documents whatsoever.
So hard.
It is a real challenge doing it that way. It really is.
I want to ask you whether, and I appreciate that you wrote the book a long time ago, but did it make you very cynical of all these cosmetic procedures, or do you just think that Madame Rachel herself was a chancer and that these days chemists have actually taught us enough that there are some legitimate procedures and products? What's your view today?
Well, what I admired about her was the incredible marketing, more than the actual cosmetics themselves. I mean, here was a Jewish woman of business in the 1860s making her way, and at times making a huge amount of money. I admired all that about her more than the actual cosmetics side of it. And in fact, she set up another branch on the Rue de la Paix in the middle of Paris, which one of her two beautiful daughters was running. So she was very, very successful and just brazen. I loved her brazenness.
Yes. Somebody sent in a question asking about her marriage, but you covered that she wasn't married to Mr. Leveson, but her first husband.
Well, her first husband drowned on an emigrant ship. Well, he'd gone out to Australia gold prospecting, apparently. He pretty much deserted her, leaving with her, I think, with the first couple of children. And then he was on his way back, and off the coast of Wales, I think, the boat went down and he drowned. So she could have married Philip Leveson, but she never did. And by him, she had several more children, including two extraordinarily beautiful daughters, who I did find mentioned, who helped run the shop in Bond Street. And one then went to Paris and ran a very successful branch there for a while.
Did you trace any descendants, or?
Oh, no, I worked it out from everything I could find, because there's a huge amount of tragedy. I mean, real dramatic tragedy in her family story. And I'm not going to tell it in case I spoil it for anyone who wants to read it. Basically, one son seems to have had one son in around the 1900s. I last had sighting. So there might be a descendant somewhere. But the other children don't seem to have had issue for various reasons.
Jean, you've already said there are lots of Wertheimer descendants who have helped you and who are listening. When do you think we might read about what you've discovered? What's the projected publication date, having whetted our appetites?
Thank you. The COVID lockdown has been in some ways a boon for writers, because
it has.
This doesn't work. And I think that I have 2 more chapters to write, and I'm aiming for the end of this year to get them at least in a draft form. So then I will have to edit and rewrite. I would hope that by fall of 21 or early 2022, there will be a book.
Oh, good luck.
And I should say that the Tate this spring, starting in February to July, I think, is going to hang the Wertheimer portraits, which are often not seen, but they're
wonderful. So
anybody who wants
can
to
go.
do that. Mhm.
I think I'm being told that sadly we've got to wrap up. But Emma, is there time for one more question, or is it just for me to thank these two brilliant ladies for all they've told us and tell everyone to go and buy their books?
Excellent. No, you're quite right, but we do actually have some more questions, and we have a little bit more time.
Here is my book, by the way. If
It's
anyone...
8:15. So we've got a couple more questions. Would you like me to ask them, Anne?
Yes, please.
Sure. So we've got a question from Hester, my boss, the project leader. Can Jean say more about the reception of Asher's portrait? These pictures seem to have divided opinion, but what does that tell us about the position of Jews in late 19th century, early 20th century London?
Oh, it tells us a lot. I don't know whether I can do that quickly, but England is different from America, and 19th century is different from 21st century. But I think it's a little hard for us to fathom how alien Jews looked to white Anglo-Saxon Protestants in this era. You know, they were used to seeing portraits by Reynolds and Lawrence and Gainsborough, and to have Jews portrayed in the same style was rather shocking to them. And many of the comments, not just to Asher's portraits, but to some of the others, even when they're favorable about the painting, they always point out that they're Jews. It's so, no, it stands out so much as a factor in the reception of all of these paintings. And some of it's very negative. The painting of Asher, which I showed you, he's standing with one hand in his pocket and the other hand holding a cigar. And the next sergeant subject, who was also posing at the same time, saw that in his studio. This is an American, rather distinguished, who said, "Looks like he's pleasantly engaged in counting golden shekels."
Oh.
So you don't have to go too far to find this. It's everywhere. But as I say, some of the responses are to the paintings themselves as masterpieces, and some are just to the Jewishness, and some respond to both. And you know, there was a show at the Metropolitan Museum in New York in 2015 of Sargent's portraits of artists and friends, and Asher was in that portrait. So many of my friends who hadn't seen the paintings saw that, and the responses were all over the map, even now. He's definitely a Jew, more than many of Sargent's other portraits of Jews. It's like he's almost exaggerating it, caricaturing it, but Asher did not mind. I think he was extremely self-confident. This is what I look like, with maybe a little more of exaggeration, but it's fascinating.
Thank you. And another question from Tessa. Do you know who took the photograph for Madame Rachel's carte de visite?
No. I mean, they're never credited, I'm afraid, or very rarely. And there were also, I don't know if you could see, there are one or two sketches done of her actually in court as well during her trials. But it's stuff like this that you get, the cartoons. I don't know if you can see that. That the most of the images of her were these very exaggerated anti-Semitic cartoons. This is the worst one, actually, that one. Can you see? But I know that there's no acknowledged artist, I'm afraid, for any of the images of her, artist or photographer.
Can I just?
Oh, I think Jean cut out for a moment there. Jean, can you hear us?
It's frozen, hasn't it?
Oh, what a shame. Oh, Jean, I think you've unfrozen now. Did you want to say something?
Sorry. Did you hear what I just said, or shall I say it again?
Okay.
Sorry. Tessa Murdoch, who just asked that question, and several others, is actually descended from another family of Jews whom Sargent painted, Mrs. Karl Meyer and her children, which is a extremely wonderful, complicated painting. So Tessa knows a great deal about this.
She actually had one more question as well. Do we know how much the Wertheimers paid for the 12 portraits by Sargent?
He was charging about 1,000 guineas per portrait at that time. And I don't know, I still have to find out whether it was more if it was 2 people or a group, as though the younger children were done in groups. I know that for the Marlborough family group, it was 2,500, so it was more, but I don't know exactly, and his financial records have not been preserved. But if we say it was about 1,000 guineas, then that would have been, then it was multiplied by 5 to think how many, oh, well, you're all in England, we don't have to turn it into dollars. Anyway, it was, and art appreciates at a rate much faster, astronomically more than just an ordinary basket of goods. So what one of those paintings now would be worth far more than what he paid for all of them then.
Wow. Any more questions from anyone? Please do feel free to write them in the Q&A or in the chat.
Do you think their shops were close together in Bond Street? That was one of the other links they had. I know that, Helen, you've located the store.
Yeah. It's the Pinet shoe shop. Do you know it?
Yeah, I do.
It's New Bond Street. It's towards the Oxford Street end.
Yes.
And it has now, I think, quite a sort of Belle Epoque 1900s frontage. So that wasn't the frontage of 47A Bond Street where Madame Rachel was there. But certainly it was quite a swanky premises. And it was just at the time when women were beginning to venture forth and go shopping and, you know, go out. And because before that, Bond Street, really, it had been men's outfitters and barbers and clubs, and it had been a male domain. But at last, you know, women were beginning to go out, and there were other cosmeticians up and down at Bond Street.
Well, next time I'm in Bond Street, I'll go and pay my respects to it. I'm utterly thrilled to talk to you both. We found lots and lots of links, and I hope everyone listening will be encouraged not only to buy the books, but to go and have a look at Willesden Cemetery and see what other wonderful stories. I can't say they're buried there because you're bringing them to life. But anyway, thank you, Jean, and thank you, Helen, thank you all for listening.
And you, Jean.
Thank you. Yes, you too. And Anne, thank you for doing a great job.
I loved your books, or learning about your books.
Well, thank
Great.
you, Anne.
Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anne, and thank you to Jean and Helen. As Anne said, please do take a look at Jean and Helen's books, but also please do come along to Willesden Jewish Cemetery. We are now open to the public, so you're very welcome to come visit us. You'll get information about coming to visit us in a follow-up email after this. Also, after this webinar, you'll have an opportunity to fill in a survey for our funders about how you found this webinar. So please do take a minute just to fill it in. That's really helpful for us. And do come along to the rest of our Lifelines events. We've got another 6 more events to come in this series over this week. Another one tomorrow night, and every night, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Sunday, and a couple of workshops during the day as well. So do have a look at that on our website. Thank you so much, and I'm going to wrap us up there.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.